Hello, dear listeners. In married life, not every woman is lucky enough to have a mother-in-law who truly loves her daughter-in-law. Some believe they are loved, only to find themselves used. Today's story is a touching confession from a young woman. She thought she had a dream mother-in-law until one night she accidentally overheard a bedroom conversation that froze her on the spot. The bitter truth, revealed at that moment, made her pack her bags in the middle of the night and return to her parents' home. Why did such a kind mother-in-law turn out to be so cruel? Why did her husband, once so caring, turn away in an instant? And what gave this young woman the strength, after so many forgiving moments, to rise and choose a new path for herself? I invite you to listen to the emotional story of a daughter-in-law whom her mother-in-law pampered beyond all measure. Tonight, I overheard a conversation that made me cry. My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. If anyone ever said that being a daughter-in-law is difficult and hurtful, I considered myself an exception. In the first months of living in my husband's home, I was surrounded by such care and love that it seemed like something out of a fairy tale. But who would have thought that beneath this warm facade lay a truth that would shatter my heart into a million pieces? I was born into a well-off family. My parents owned a successful construction materials business, so from childhood, I lacked nothing. Money for my studies, clothes, and trips with friends, everything was plentiful. Despite this, my parents taught me to be modest and to think of others. I grew up enveloped in this love, believing that life consisted only of ease and beauty. Then I met David at a gathering of two long-standing family friends. He was the son of Robert Sr., my father's best friend since their time serving in the military. David was tall, handsome, spoke softly, and with restraint. But what impressed me most was how respectfully he treated elders, never sitting until invited, and never needing a reminder to offer a greeting. Our relationship began with simple messages and gradually deepened. After about a year of dating, he proposed to me. I nodded without hesitation, not just because I loved him, but because I genuinely felt that his family was a place I could trust. My future mother-in-law, Carol Ann, smiled kindly at our first meeting, took my hand, and said, "What a sweet girl with a kind face. It's clear you're good. Become our daughter-in-law. I promise I'll love you like my own daughter." At that moment, I blushed and looked away, but in my heart, an indescribable joy fluttered. What young woman, preparing to become a daughter-in-law, could dream of such a loving mother-in-law from the very beginning? Our wedding took place in one of the city's most luxurious banquet halls. Everyone came to congratulate us, and each person admired that I was marrying such a wonderful man. My husband's family was refined, and my mother-in-law was elegant, warm, and understanding. One friend even whispered in my ear, "You must have been a saint in a past life to get such a kind mother-in-law." I listened and smiled blissfully. After the wedding, I moved into my husband's home. It was a spacious 4-story house in a quiet, tree-lined suburban neighborhood. My husband's parents lived on the second floor, and David and I lived on the third. Every morning, my mother-in-law would already be preparing breakfast and gently wake me. "Wake up, darling, breakfast is ready. You didn't come here to suffer." Several times I tried to help her wash dishes or clean up, but she would wave me off. "Let Mom do it. You've just moved in. You're not used to it yet. You might break something, and I'd feel bad." My husband also loved me immensely. Returning from work, he would go to the kitchen to help his mother cook, sending me to our room to rest. I felt like a princess who had stepped into a magical world where my husband's entire family cherished and pampered me. I spared nothing for my mother-in-law. All the money I had saved before marriage, I entrusted to her for safekeeping. For her birthday, I gave her a gold chain and took her to a day spa. The feeling that I could be her daughter, call her mom, made me truly happy. In those days, I thought I had reached the pinnacle of a happy family life. After the wedding, I hardly had to do anything. Life flowed like a sweet dream. Every morning, my mother-in-law would rise early, prepare a delicious breakfast, and wake me with a soft knock on the door and the familiar phrase, "Sarah, come down for breakfast, darling. Your favorite sunny-side-up eggs are ready." I would go downstairs and see the table already set. A glass of milk poured, and she would ask, "Did you sleep well? Does your back hurt?" My husband drove me to work every morning. In the evenings, we would have dinner with his parents, then go upstairs to watch movies and talk. Our married life seemed so cloudless. One day, as I was getting ready for work, my mother-in-law unexpectedly called me into her room. Her face was a little tense, but her voice remained soft. "Sarah, I need to ask you something." I nodded, without hesitation. "Yes, Mom, tell me. What's wrong?" She paused a moment, then quietly said, "Aunt Susan and I want to open a small wellness center. You know, massages for seniors. Susan has a space and specialists. We just need some startup capital. Could you lend me $8,000? I feel awkward asking your father or David." I was surprised, but immediately smiled. "Of course, Mom. I have a savings account. I'll withdraw the money for you right away. Just make a note of the amount so I can track it and get it back later." My mother-in-law took my hand. Her eyes shone with gratitude. "Thank you, darling. I knew you'd be understanding." And that was it. I was even more convinced how lucky I was to be her daughter-in-law. That same day, I withdrew the money and gave it to her without any formal agreement. To me, she was Mom, and I believed her every word, without a drop of doubt. But who would have thought that this very moment would mark the beginning of a series of doubts and emotional wounds for me? Just 2 weeks later, my mother-in-law called me into her room again. This time in the evening, when David was away on a business trip. "Sarah, the center's premises are being renovated, and I'm a little short on funds again. Could you lend me another $2,000? I hesitated slightly. Although I had a good salary, $2,000 was no small sum. Plus, I had just given her $8,000. But I thought she probably felt uncomfortable asking my husband, and starting a business is an expensive endeavor. I agreed. From then on, requests for money became regular. Each time, there was a new reason. Sometimes it was rent, sometimes equipment purchases, sometimes an urgent debt to repay. First $2,000, then $4,000. In total, I had given her almost $20,000. When I gently asked one day, "Mom, when is the center opening? I'd love to drop by and congratulate you," my mother-in-law suddenly flinched and waved her hands. "Oh, no, not yet. I'm going through a bad astrological period right now. The stars aren't aligned. Susan says we need to wait out this month." This answer made me freeze. Something churned inside me. The intuition that women so often have told me that things were not as they seemed. One day, when my mother-in-law was out, I secretly called Aunt Susan, with whom she was supposedly opening the business. After a few indirect questions, I was stunned by her answer. "What? A wellness center? Sarah, your mother and I aren't opening anything. I haven't been involved in any business for a long time." My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. What did this mean? I hung up the phone. My hands trembled, and an icy chill ran down my spine. It turned out it was all a lie. I waited for my mother-in-law to return, and unable to hold back, I asked directly, "Mom, I just spoke with Aunt Susan. She said you're not opening any center. Please explain." My mother-in-law froze. She stammered, Well, we planned to, and then we changed our minds. Don't be mad, darling." I waited silently for her to continue, and then she knelt down. Yes, my mother-in-law, the woman I considered kind and decent, fell to the floor, hugged my legs, and sobbed. "I'm guilty, darling. I don't have any center. I was gambling, and I lost everything. I thought I'd win it back, but the more I played, the more I lost. I was afraid your husband would find out, that he'd demand a divorce. I could only ask you for help. I was dumbfounded. I had been too trusting. The exemplary mother-in-law I had been so proud of to my friends had been deceiving me day after day, month after month, so thoughtfully and intricately. After that night, when my mother-in-law confessed her gambling addiction on her knees, I couldn't sleep. Memories raced through my head. The breakfasts she cooked, the medicine she bought, the tender hugs when I returned home late. All of it turned out to be just a mask. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was cold and cruel. It tore me from the sweet illusions I had cherished. The next morning, I silently packed my bags, planning to go to my parents' house for a few days to collect myself. But my mother-in-law was already waiting at my bedroom door. "Sarah, I beg you, don't leave. I know I'm wrong." I promise I'll never gamble again. From this day forward, I'll change." I looked at her silently. Her eyes were swollen. She had clearly cried all night. In that moment, my heart wavered. "Okay, I'll stay, but I hope you keep your word. I don't want this to affect our family." She hugged me. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she nodded like a child. I naively believed that leniency could change a person. But I was wrong. About 2 weeks later, she asked me for money again. This time, $1,200. The reason? To repay a debt to acquaintances. They lent me money when things were tight. Now I need to return it urgently. I hesitated but tried to reassure myself that she really needed the money. I gave it to her. A week later, another $2,000. Sometimes she claimed she was scammed by a Ponzi scheme. Sometimes she lost the money. The reasons became increasingly strange. Each time, she pleaded, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears. I wanted to refuse, but looking into those eyes, I couldn't. My husband knew nothing. He thought my mom and I had a wonderful relationship, that we were taking care of the family together. I kept silent because I didn't want to put him in an awkward position between the two most important women in his life. One day I ventured to ask, "Mom, do you keep a record of the amounts I've given you so I can keep track too? Because you ask from time to time, and I'm getting confused." She blinked, then laughed. "My goodness, darling, you talk as if I'm a stranger. I'm borrowing, not stealing. I remember everything. As soon as I have the money, I'll return it all." At that moment, my heart felt heavy. I knew it was an irresponsible answer, but I dared not object. I don't know why, but I kept clinging to the fragile hope that she would really change. During that period, I lived in constant tension. I started hiding from my husband that I had given his mother almost $20,000. I was afraid he would be upset, disappointed, and I was also afraid that I would be considered foolish and gullible. I lost my appetite. I no longer enjoyed walks with my husband as before. He noticed these changes and asked, "What's wrong with you? You've been strange lately. Are you hiding something from me?" I just brushed it off with a smile. Just a little tired, probably because of work. I didn't dare tell him, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wasn't ready to see his reaction when he found out that his own mother had repeatedly deceived his wife. And so, one day, I decided to visit my mother-in-law's former workplace, where she once sold cosmetics. I wanted to learn more. Her former colleague, Lisa, looked at me with sympathy when I began to ask, "Sarah, I don't want to meddle in your business, but since you're her daughter-in-law, you probably should know. Your mother-in-law hasn't sold cosmetics for a long time, and I heard that lately she's gotten into slot machines. She even borrowed money from someone here." Hearing this, my heart clenched. The feeling of betrayal couldn't be worse. That evening, I decided to talk to my mother-in-law. This time, it wasn't a soft question. I wanted a clear answer. "Mom, I'm asking you to tell me the truth this time. You borrowed a total of almost $20,000 from me. Tell me honestly, what did you spend that money on?" My mother-in-law was silent. After a while, she burst into tears. "I was gambling. I know I shouldn't have, but I can't stop. Every time I lost, I thought I'd win it back, and then I'd lose again. It's like a devil, darling. Forgive me." My head swam. I tried to stay calm, but my voice was already trembling. "Mom, why didn't you tell David? Why did all this fall on my shoulders? Why didn't you think about the consequences?" My mother-in-law just lowered her head and remained silent. I took a deep breath and slowly said, "I can't do this anymore. If you want my trust, at least don't lie to me. From today on, I won't give you another dime. If you need help, the whole family needs to know about it. No more secrets." She looked at me with reddened eyes and said nothing. I left the room with a heavy heart. Perhaps it was time to have an honest conversation with my husband. Leaving my mother-in-law's room that evening, I went upstairs with a heavy heart. I could no longer pretend or stay silent. Too much money had been spent on empty promises, on words like "this is the last time." I couldn't carry this family alone out of pity and respect. The next morning, as soon as David sat down at the table, I quietly said, "David, this evening I'd like to have a family meeting. I need to clarify something." He looked at me in surprise but nodded. Something so serious that we need a meeting? Or did Mom do something again? I remained silent. I knew that any answers now would be pointless without everyone present. That evening, after dinner, I quickly cleared the table. My father-in-law, mother-in-law, and husband sat in the living room. The atmosphere was a little oppressive. I sat down, took a deep breath, and began. I apologize for having to do this today, but I think the truth can no longer be hidden. This concerns money and trust. I turned to my mother-in-law and looked her directly in the eyes. She lowered her gaze, wringing her hands. Mom, you borrowed a lot of money from me, almost $20,000 in total. First, you talked about opening a center, then about working capital, then there were other reasons. I trusted you, didn't ask questions, didn't check, but I just found out everything. You didn't open any center. You spent all that money on gambling and deceived me for many months. The air in the room seemed to freeze. My father-in-law paled. He slowly raised his head and looked at his wife. His voice was hoarse. Is that true, Carol? My mother-in-law trembled. Tears streamed down her face. I'm guilty. I truly am. I just thought I could win it back. I didn't mean to. David, stunned, took my hand and looked at his mother. Mom, how could you? You told me you quit. Last year, you promised Dad and me you would never gamble again. My mother-in-law sobbed. I know, I'm awful. But I got sucked back in. I thought I'd win, then I'd lose again and borrow more to try and win it back. I didn't want Dad to know, and I could only rely on Sarah. I turned to my husband, my voice breaking. You know, I don't care about the money. I'm hurt by the deception. I thought Mom loved me like her own daughter. I didn't think she saw me as just a walking ATM from which she could take money, all while smiling at me every day. My father-in-law remained silent for a long time, then unexpectedly stood up and walked into his room. My mother-in-law cried after him, Robert, don't leave. Forgive me, I'll quit. I swear, this time for sure. But he didn't turn back. My husband sat like a stone. After a long silence, he gently squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, Sarah. I had no idea things had gotten this bad. How long have you been enduring this alone? I looked at him. Mixed feelings raged inside me. Perhaps I wasn't as angry at him as I was at myself for trying to preserve a family that only hid its internal rot. The next morning, everyone was silent. The atmosphere was taut as a string. My father-in-law left for work early, without saying goodbye to anyone. My mother-in-law sat quietly in her room. In the evening, when I returned from work and had just set down my bag, I saw my mother-in-law waiting for me in the living room. She wore an old housecoat. In her hands, she held a stack of papers. Seeing me, she said with tears in her eyes, I wrote this commitment. I beg you, give me a chance to mend my ways. I promise to go to church every week, to break off with all my gambling friends. I will apologize to your father, but I ask you, please don't leave this house. I took the paper, my eyes stinging. I hadn't thought about leaving, but I also couldn't forgive so easily. If I was constantly forgiving, who would take responsibility for the cracks in my soul? I gently said, Mom, I won't leave, but I need time. From this moment on, everything concerning money, you must discuss with the entire family, not just me. I don't want to be a shadow of trust anymore. My mother-in-law covered her face with her hands and cried. I silently turned and went to my room. For the first time since the wedding, I felt so distant from my mother-in-law, though only a few steps separated us. I returned to work, but my thoughts constantly wandered in this tangled mess from which I couldn't find a way out. Images of my mother-in-law crying on her knees, my father-in-law silently leaving, David's disappointed gaze. All of it haunted me every night. I no longer spoke to my husband about money. I didn't want to stir up the past. Although turmoil reigned in my soul, I tried to act as if everything had passed, as if any wound would heal with time. But in reality, it was self-deception. David had become more silent lately. He often returned late, citing work. I didn't know if it was true, but I didn't have the strength to inquire. I was learning to live with a sense of anxiety in my own home. One evening, as I finished washing the dishes, my father-in-law returned. He entered the house looking tired. In his hand, he held a package. Hello, He nodded slightly to me, then looked upstairs. "Where's your mother?" I answered vaguely. "She's been in her room since lunch. The door is closed." He said nothing, just removed his shoes and slowly went upstairs. About 10 minutes later, I heard shouts from the second floor. My father-in-law's voice enunciated every word. "How many times have I let you off? I've put up with enough. Gambling to the point of borrowing money from your daughter-in-law, and then planning to hide it all." My mother-in-law's voice sounded muffled. "I know I'm wrong. It was an accident. Don't yell. The neighbors will hear." My father-in-law almost roared. "Let them hear. Let them know the true face of this family. Do you even know how ashamed I am?" I stood in the kitchen, clutching the edge of the table, feeling a pain that was impossible to express in words. It turned out my husband's family was far from perfect. The outward refinement, softness, and gentleness of my mother-in-law were merely a cover for internal chaos. The next day, as I was getting ready for work, my father-in-law called me. "Sarah, come in. We need to talk." I put my bag on a chair and followed him into the living room. He poured me a glass of water and thoughtfully said, "Forgive us, darling. I should have told you earlier, but I was afraid. Afraid that you would leave David, that our family would fall apart." I lowered my gaze. He continued, "Your mother-in-law didn't just get into gambling yesterday. She started playing when she was still selling cosmetics. Back then, she lost all the money meant for purchasing inventory and was forced to quit. I took her for treatment. I wanted to divorce her, but David cried, begged me to forgive her. She promised to quit, but then she'd relapse again." I looked up, disbelieving. "So, why did you hide this from me? Why didn't anyone say anything? I'm his wife. Didn't I have a right to know?" He sighed, looking at me with an expression of self-loathing. "Because your mother-in-law is an excellent actress. She portrayed kindness and decency to you. David believed her, and no one listened to me. And you had just joined the family. If you had known earlier, would you have decided to enter this home?" I was silent. This question made me freeze. Indeed, if I had known then that my mother-in-law was a deceitful gambler, would I have married David? Probably, I would have turned and walked away. He looked at me with bitterness. "I have no strength left. If she continues like this, I will really divorce her. I don't make empty threats. And I ask you, don't carry everything on your shoulders. A young woman, just married, already forced to swallow tears. It's too hard." My nose stung. I stood up and bowed my head slightly. "Yes, thank you, Dad, for telling me the truth. I also don't want the family to fall apart, but I can't always pretend I don't know anything and keep forgiving." My father-in-law nodded, as if he felt a little relieved. That evening, as I sat on the balcony, looking out at the street, David quietly approached and sat beside me. He handed me a glass of warm water and softly said, "I know you've endured much more than you're telling." I didn't turn, just remained silent. I'm not defending Mom, but I don't know what the right thing to do is. If she were a stranger, it would be easier, but she's my own mother. How can I yell at her? How can I abandon her? I see it. I understand, but understanding doesn't mean accepting. We've been married for less than a year. Our love isn't deep enough yet to heal all wounds. David took my hand. For the first time in these days of silence, his hand trembled. "I'll do whatever you ask. Just don't leave me." I turned to him. There was sincerity and despair in his eyes. "I won't leave you, but if this happens again, I won't forgive again." A family cannot be held together by one person's efforts. We sat in silence for a long time. The wind carried a light scent of lilac, but my heart felt heavy as a stone, because I knew that however sincere apologies might be, addiction, especially to gambling, is not easy to overcome. And my intuition told me that this was not the end. After that conversation, my mother-in-law abruptly changed her behavior. She no longer mentioned debts or money. Every morning, she woke up early, cooked, cleaned, doing everything meticulously and carefully. She started wearing modest clothes, putting on a headscarf, and going to the nearby church. Anyone who saw her would say she had become a different person. Quiet, reserved, gentle. One day, when I returned from work, she even offered me a box of pastries she had baked herself. Her voice was soft. Try them, darling. I learned to bake them at church today. Very tasty, just sweet enough, fragrant, good for the soul. I took the box, smiled, and nodded, but a strange feeling arose within me. I don't know why, but I wasn't happy. I felt cold. Her silence, her unusual submissiveness, didn't seem like genuine repentance to me. It was like a fog covering a scorched field. Beneath this calm, I felt something smoldering. David seemed to sigh with relief, seeing how his mother had changed. He even joyfully told me, "You see, Mom is completely different lately." Yesterday, she even asked if I wanted to go to service with her. She says she's signing up for adult theology courses. I smiled, trying not to spoil my husband's mood, but deep down, I was wary. Instinct told me not to believe immediately, not to give in too soon. I began secretly observing my mother-in-law's life. Every time she left the house, I checked the clock. She said she was going to church, but sometimes she would leave at 9 a.m. and return almost at 3 p.m., looking tired, and sometimes her clothes smelled of cigarette smoke. I cautiously asked, "Mom, were you at church for so long? Is there a special holiday today that you're so late?" She would blanch and reply, "Yes, there were many people today. I prayed for a long time, and then I stayed to have lunch with the parishioners." I said nothing more, but suspicions began to form in my mind. One Saturday, when David was at work, I pretended to go visit a friend. In reality, I sat in a small cafe not far from our house and watched from afar. Around 10 a.m., I saw my mother-in-law leave the house. She was wearing modest clothes, carrying a cloth bag. She walked towards the intersection. I stood up, called a taxi, and discreetly followed her. She turned into an alley, but not towards the church. She entered a single-story building with a sign, "Cafe, Rest." I froze. It was an underground gambling club. About 3 hours later, she emerged, pale and unsteady. I lowered my head so she wouldn't see me. My heart burned with fire. All my hopes, all the fragile faith I had tried to cling to, collapsed once again. I returned home before her, silently poured myself water, and waited in the living room. When she entered, I looked at her. Seeing me, she paused for a second, then tried to smile. "Oh, you didn't go out?" I didn't answer, just quietly asked, "Was it crowded at church today, Mom?" She blinked. "Yes, very crowded. I'm tired. People." I stood up and looked her directly in the eyes. "I followed you all morning. What else do you want to say?" My mother-in-law's face paled. She collapsed onto a chair, covering her face with her hands. This time without tears, just silence. But I no longer felt the same pain as before. I was angry. I ground out through clenched teeth. "How long do you intend to deceive me? Last time I forgave you, I asked you to stop, but you continued. This time you pretended to go to church. You deceived my husband, his father. You deceived everyone. Did you even think about the consequences?" My mother-in-law said nothing, only trembled. I straightened up. My voice was calm to the point of being icy. "Listen to me carefully. From today on, I will not be silent. I will tell his father, I will tell my husband, and if necessary, I will take you for treatment. You cannot live in this house and continue to destroy it." That evening, when David returned, I told him everything. At first, he didn't believe me, but when I showed him the photographs I had taken outside the gambling club, he froze. He said nothing, just sat silently and held his head in his hands. "Mom, how could you?" he repeated 3 times, like a child abandoned in an open field. I put my hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. But now I think we need to make a serious decision. We cannot continue to live in a house full of lies." David looked up. His eyes were red. "You're right. This time, I won't enable her. I won't let her destroy everything just because she's my mother." After everything came to light, a period of unprecedented tension settled over the house. At the dinner table, there was an icy silence. No one spoke more than 2 or 3 words to each other. My mother-in-law became a shadow. She spent entire days in her room, emerging only when necessary. All her former softness and tenderness had turned into a strained silence that exhausted everyone. I also had no desire to preserve anything. I tried to forgive, telling myself that if she repented, everything would return to normal. But I was wrong. Some people, once immersed in a harmful habit, only repent for a time until the next relapse. David remained eerily silent. He no longer defended his mother, but also didn't know what to do. He lived like a man suffocating from reality, suffering but not daring to rebel. I knew he loved his mother, but the stronger the love, the greater the pain. That evening, after a long and tiring workday, I fell asleep to the sound of rain. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to go to the bathroom. Carefully descending the stairs, I suddenly realized David wasn't beside me. I checked the first floor. He wasn't there. Passing by my mother-in-law's room, I froze. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim yellow light seeped through the crack. I moved closer, about to call my husband, but stopped when I heard my mother-in-law's muffled and desperate voice. "Son, I beg you, help me one last time. If I don't give them the money, they won't leave me alone. They're threatening to spray paint the house, throw rocks at the windows. I promise. I honestly promise. This is the last time." I froze, clenching my fists. Then David's tired voice spoke. "Mom, I don't have the money. Seriously. All my salary and bonuses I give to Sarah. I asked her for a loan, but she wouldn't give it. I was stunned. It turned out he wasn't asking me for himself, but at his mother's instigation. My mother-in-law's voice grew lower and more insidious. Then secretly take her gold wedding jewelry, those large necklaces, bracelets. She probably doesn't even remember how many there are. One will be enough, and then I'll return it. She won't even notice." I froze, as if struck. Every word, like an icy knife, pierced my heart. I couldn't believe it. The mother who promised to treat me like a daughter, the husband who swore to protect me all his life. Now they were together, in the darkness, like common thieves, plotting to steal my possessions. I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed open the door and entered. My mother-in-law flinched, as if she'd seen a ghost. David froze. His face went white. I looked at both of them. My voice was cold as ice. "Mom, what kind of mother teaches her son to steal from his wife?" My mother-in-law stammered. You were listening in?" I laughed a bitter laugh. "No, Mom, I wasn't listening in. I distinctly heard every word. You're making my husband steal my wedding jewelry. The things I brought from my parents' home. That's a memory. That's trust. That's my family's respect for this marriage." David stood up, trying to approach me. "Sarah, listen to me." I stepped back. "What else do you want to say? That it's just this one time? That your mother is having a very hard time? Do you even know that each of those pieces of jewelry represents my parents' hard work, which they saved up their whole lives so I could become a wife in your home? And now your mother sees me as a safe, and you silently allow her to pick the lock." My mother-in-law protested. "I just spoke out of anger. I was scared and I blurted it out. I didn't actually take anything." I glared at her and, for the first time, shouted, "But you dared to think that. And you, David, you sat there and listened, not saying a word against it." David lowered his head. A second or two, then he blurted out, "You're part of the family now. You should help in a difficult moment. Mom treated you so well, never made you do anything, so what's wrong with helping her a little?" I laughed, then cried. "So, because she didn't make me wash dishes, I should give her my wedding gold in gratitude?" David flared up. "You're saying too much. How dare you speak to my mother like that?" Before I could react, smack. A powerful slap landed on my face. I fell to the floor, stunned. My cheek stung. My heart ached, not from the blow, but from shattering into 1,000 pieces. I no longer cried. I stood up. My voice was terrifyingly calm. "Thank you. Thanks to you and Mom, I understood one thing. I was never a true daughter-in-law in this house. I was just a walking ATM." And I turned and went upstairs to pack my things, under the silent stares of those two. As I walked out the door with a small suitcase, it was raining. The cold wind hit my face, reminding me that this was reality, not a dream. I called a taxi and went to my parents' house. That night, I sat on the porch, hugging my knees, and tears flowed incessantly. The next morning, my father sat beside me. He didn't ask many questions. just said one sentence. If you want a divorce, your mother and I will support your decision. But if you want to save your marriage, we are ready to walk this path with you. I hugged my father and burst into tears. Returning to my parents' house almost a year after marriage, I felt mixed emotions, something familiar and something foreign. Familiar, because it was the nest of my childhood, the cool porch, the kitchen with the aroma of my mother's soup. Foreign, because I had gone through too much pain and returned with a soul that was no longer whole. I spoke little, only telling my mother I was tired. Mom nodded, brushed the hair from my face, and silently brought me clean pajamas. She didn't ask anything else. She probably understood that the tears I shed on my pillow that night said everything for me. Father was different. He had always been reserved, calm, rarely showing emotions. But the next morning, as I brewed tea, he sat at the table, looked out into the distance, and quietly said, "I know you suffered the most in that house." I looked up at him. A lump rose in my throat. I didn't expect things to turn out this way. I thought I would have a good husband, a kind mother-in-law. When we married you off, we didn't think so either. But that's life, darling. Nothing is certain. The main thing is not to lose yourself in other people's lives. I took his wrinkled hand. Tears streamed again. The next few days, I took a week off work. I didn't want to talk to anyone, turned off my phone, and stayed offline. I needed to collect myself. Every morning, I went out onto the balcony and looked at the quiet street in front of the house. Cars passed, people rushed, and I was like a shard, floating aimlessly, not knowing whether to stop or drift further. Mom was very delicate. She didn't console, didn't lecture, just silently did all the work, washing, cooking, brewing tea. Sometimes, she would stroke my hair and say, "What's broken can be glued back together. But if the mended piece still hurts, you need to know when to let go." That's also a way to love yourself. Hearing this, my eyes welled up. On the 5th day, I decided to turn on my phone. There were many messages from David, sometimes short, "I'm sorry," sometimes long, with "Please, come back, Mom will change. I can't live without you." I didn't reply. I knew that any answer from me now would only prolong the pain for both of us. In the evening, David drove to our house. Mom opened the door but didn't let him in. She just said, "She's not ready. Please leave. When she wants to see you, she'll call." I sat in my room and heard everything but didn't come out. I didn't cry, just remained silent. David stood at the gate for about an hour and then silently drove away. That evening, I wrote a short entry in my diary. I've endured enough. I loved, I believed, I hoped. But there are lines that cannot be crossed. There is trust that, once broken, can never be fully mended. On the 7th day, I went to the farmer's market with Mom. Acquaintances, seeing me, asked, "Oh, Sarah, visiting? Haven't seen you in a while." I just politely smiled in return. Yes, came to relax for a couple of days. Mom bought vegetables and fish, then quietly asked me, "What are you going to do? You can't go on like this indefinitely. Your relationship with your husband needs to be clarified." I nodded. That evening, I sat down with my parents. I will go back to my husband's house, but not to be the same daughter-in-law I was before. I will go back to talk to David honestly. If he chooses his mother over his wife again, if he still sees me as a bottomless ATM, I will file for divorce. Mom was silent. Dad nodded. Any decision you make will be the right one, as long as you live peacefully and without resentment. Before going to bed, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. My face was pale, dark circles under my eyes from sleepless nights, but I noticed that there was still strength in those eyes. I hadn't broken. I still had my self-respect. And most importantly, I dared to leave when I was insulted. I clenched my fists. Whatever happens, tomorrow I will move forward, as a woman whom no one will ever deceive again. I returned to my husband's home on a cloudy evening. The weather seemed to reflect my state. The ground was wet after the night's rain, and my mood was no better. A mess, dampness, a quiet heaviness. When the car stopped at the gate, I froze for a few seconds. The house, which I once considered my nest, now felt foreign. I took a deep breath, telling myself, I need to be strong one more time. David opened the door. He stood before me, thinner, with disheveled hair and sunken eyes, as if he had spent many sleepless nights. Seeing me, he froze, then, without a word, stepped aside, avoiding my gaze. I wheeled my suitcase in, without a greeting. The house was eerily silent. My father-in-law was reading a newspaper in the living room. Seeing me, he put it down. There was anxiety in his eyes. "You're back?" I nodded slightly. "Yes, I'm back to clarify everything." He said nothing more, just gestured for me to sit down. David stood leaning against a column, not daring to meet my eyes. My mother-in-law hadn't appeared from her room since I entered. I sighed and slowly began. I didn't come back for things to be as they were before. I came back to say my final word. My father-in-law nodded, listening in silence. I turned to David. "Do you want to continue this marriage?" David nodded almost imperceptibly. His voice was hoarse. "Yes, I do." I realized my mistake. "I'm sorry." I looked at him, my voice was firm. "Then, from this day on, you have no right to give your mother a single penny without my consent. All expenses must be transparent. My wedding gold, jewelry, and savings, I will put in a bank account in my name. I no longer want to see your mother persuading you to steal from your wife." David blushed and lowered his head. "I agree." I turned to my father-in-law. "Dad, I ask you to be a witness to this. If it were only about promises, what happened wouldn't have happened." He nodded, looking at me with a deep gaze. "I will fulfill my role as the elder in this house. I was wrong to let all this drag on. I will not let you carry everything on your shoulders anymore." I pressed my lips together. Finally, I stood up tall. "I will live here for some time longer. If anything similar happens again, I will file for divorce. Without warnings, without second chances." My father-in-law nodded. David remained silent. My mother-in-law still did not come out. That evening, I cleaned our room, locked the closet, took all my jewelry and documents, and drove them to my parents' house for temporary safekeeping. I was no longer naive. I needed to be sure that even if this marriage collapsed, I would keep what belonged to me. David wanted to talk, but I refused. "I'm tired. I need time." He nodded and turned away. There was sadness in his eyes, but I no longer succumbed to pity. The next few days, the atmosphere in the house was oppressive. I performed my duties, cooked, cleaned, took care of my husband, but all of it happened in silence. My mother-in-law lived like a recluse, not daring to leave her room or meet my gaze. Perhaps she understood that I was no longer the obedient daughter-in-law who could be easily fooled. David had noticeably changed. He came home from work on time, didn't drink, didn't meet with friends, but he still seemed like a shadow to me. Maybe he was ashamed, or maybe he was afraid of losing me for good. A week later, my mother-in-law knocked on my door. "Sarah, forgive me. I was sitting at my desk and didn't turn around. I know I'm wrong. I hurt you. I just want you to know. I don't hate you. I just got sucked in. I swear, I will never touch gambling again." I turned and looked at her. Her eyes were swollen and red. She had lost weight. "Mom, I don't need promises anymore. I need actions. If you truly want to change, show it with your life. Don't say anything, because I'm tired of promises." She nodded and left. The door closed in silence. I knew it would be a long road ahead. Forgiving isn't easy, and forgetting is even harder. But I dared to come back to face the problem head-on, to define my boundaries, to become the mistress of my own life. And that, for me, was already a big breakthrough. In the darkness of those days, I wished for one thing. If we cannot truly love each other, let us at least live humanely. David started to change after the day I laid down firm conditions. He seemed to live in a mode of atonement, quiet, abstaining from alcohol and friends, coming home from work on time, helping me in the kitchen and with chores. Things he had never done before. He now performed carefully and with restraint, as if fearing that the slightest mistake would make him lose me forever. I saw his efforts, but my heart found it difficult to heal so quickly. That slap, though only once, left a deep scar on my trust. One evening, as I was folding clothes, David entered the room with a cup of hot ginger tea. He offered it to me, sat on a chair, and after a moment of silence, said, I'm sorry. I didn't answer. I know one apology cannot compensate for everything you've endured. But every day, living with you after what happened, I want to start anew. I looked up. My gaze was calm. Starting anew is easy, but erasing what has already happened is impossible. David lowered his head. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking for one more chance. A chance to make amends. I looked at him and asked, what if it were the other way around? If I had been caught stealing from my husband, if I had been caught trying to persuade your mother to steal your gold, would you have the composure to apologize to me like this? He was silent. My eyes welled up. I don't need a perfect husband. I need you to respect me, like in the very first days. But when respect is lost, everything else becomes meaningless. David took my hand and gently squeezed it. I know. I'll do everything to show you. I'm not like Mom. David kept his word. For the next 2 weeks, he was an exemplary husband. Every evening, we read books together, watched movies, without mentioning the past. He no longer brought up his mother, or defended her, as before. One day, he even told her directly, Mom, under no circumstances are you to touch my wife's money again. If you need something, tell me. But don't ask Sarah for another dime. My mother-in-law paled, but this time she didn't dare object, just silently went to her room. I looked at David, and something new sparked in my soul. Not that love had suddenly reignited, but I felt lighter. He had finally sided with the truth. But this peace didn't last long. One Saturday, when I returned from work, my mother-in-law unexpectedly entered my room with a bag in her hands. Sarah, I need to talk to you. I put my bag on the table and looked at her. Yes, go ahead. She sat on the edge of the bed and quietly began. I know you're still angry. I don't blame you. I'm wrong, I admit it. But today I want to ask you one thing. I tensed up. Yes, my younger sister, your aunt, was diagnosed with a fibroid back home. She doesn't have money for the operation. And I, as you know, have no money at all. I know you have savings. I'm asking you, just this once, lend me $300. I swear I'll return it. I froze, staring at her intently. She could look me straight in the eyes and ask for money after everything that had happened? Mom, do you think I still believe your words? I swear, this time it's true. If you don't believe me, call my sister. I'll give you her number. I interrupted her. No need. I won't lend you another dime. Even if the person is truly sick, you are no longer someone I can trust. A flash of anger flickered, and then died in my mother-in-law's eyes. She sighed. I understand. I know you consider me a stranger, but, darling, someday you'll be a mother too, and then you'll understand. There are moments when a mother cannot calmly watch her loved ones suffer. I coldly replied, and there are moments when a woman must be decisive, otherwise she will be trampled upon without mercy. My mother-in-law stood up and, without another word, left, quietly closing the door behind her. I collapsed onto the bed. My heart ached. I wasn't selfish. If her word was true, if my aunt really needed money for an operation, I wouldn't begrudge it. But I couldn't entrust money to a person who had deceived me countless times. I took out my phone, opened my expense records, and reviewed all the amounts I had given her. Over $20,000, that was the price of my blind trust. Now I couldn't make a mistake again. That evening, David learned what had happened. He froze for a moment, then said, I'll give Mom that money myself. You don't need to get involved. I looked at him, and a feeling of uncertainty washed over me. I'm not forbidding it, but I repeat, if our family's money goes to your mother's needs, I will not stay here for another day. David nodded. His voice was muffled. I know, and I won't disappoint you again. Ever since my mother-in-law tried to trick money out of me using my aunt's illness as an excuse, a flicker of doubt had remained in my soul. I no longer knew where the truth ended and the lies began. The trust that had once been there had long since crumbled to dust. Promises, tears, even sorrowful sighs, I had seen it all before and suffered because of it. I didn't want to give in to pity any longer. From that day on, I started observing every gesture, every facial expression of my mother-in-law even more closely. I no longer believed in her ailing appearance or phrases like, "It's nothing, I'll manage." I understood perfectly well that if a person was accustomed to hiding and fabricating, all their words needed to be verified. One morning, I called in sick to work, saying I wasn't feeling well. David left early. I lay in the room, pretending to be asleep. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the quiet opening of my mother-in-law's door. Careful footsteps on the stairs, then the click of the front door. I waited a few minutes, then quietly got dressed and went out. I didn't call a taxi, but walked, following her through a few streets until I saw her enter a modest cafe in an alley. From the outside, the sign was ordinary, but I knew what was inside. It was the same place where she had played cards last time. And now, she was there again. I didn't go in. I stood on the other side of the street and watched through the murky glass. My mother-in-law sat in the corner, cards in her hands, her lips pursed, her gaze tense. She looked nothing like the woman who had just been confronted by her daughter-in-law and who had sworn to change. I took a few photos and silently walked away. This time, I didn't feel pain. I felt sorry for myself. I had tried so hard, and all my efforts were in vain. That evening, when my mother-in-law returned, I was waiting for her in the living room. She came in, saw me, flinched slightly, but tried to maintain a composed expression. "Oh, you're not asleep yet," I nodded. "Yes, I'm waiting for you." "Where were you today?" "I went to church for a while. It's a big holiday today. The priest asked for help, so I stayed late." I smirked, pulled out my phone, and opened the photos. "Yes. And where exactly is this church, Mom?" She looked at the screen. Her eyes filled with horror. Her face paled. You were following me?" I calmly replied, "No, Mom, I don't need to follow anyone. I just wanted to know if you deserved for me to continue calling you Mom." She collapsed onto a chair, clutching her chest, breathing heavily. "Sarah, I know, I'm guilty. I have an addiction. I can't stop." I shook my head. "No, you can't stop, you won't stop. You just want others to pay for your relapses. My husband, even his father, we were all just a shield for you." Tears streamed down my mother-in-law's face, but this time I felt no pity. I felt emptiness. "Mom, I've forgiven too many times. Now I won't anymore. What are you going to do?" I looked at her. My voice was firm. "I'll tell his father everything. I'll also talk to my husband. If you continue, I will move out of this house. This time, I'm not threatening. I will do it." David returned, and I showed him the photographs. He froze. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I thought Mom would change this time." I looked at him with a sad smile. People don't change unless they're pushed to their limits. If you don't do anything, I'll take care of myself. I've endured enough." David nodded. He buried his face in his hands and unexpectedly said, "Then give me a week. I'll talk to Dad, so you don't have to expose Mom. I want to resolve everything myself one last time." I agreed, but in my heart, I was ready for any scenario, even having to leave this house again. This time, not because I was forced out or insulted, but because I wanted to preserve my dignity. After that night's conversation, David barely spoke. He became more withdrawn, smiled less, showed no emotions. I knew he was torn. On one side, his mother, who bore and raised him. On the other, his wife, who had been by his side and suffered so much because of his weakness. I didn't rush him, silently waiting the week he requested, but my heart was uneasy. On Sunday, the sky was gray. A strong wind blew, foreshadowing something ominous. At lunch, the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. My father-in-law sat at the head of the table, calmly pouring himself some sauce. He had no idea that in a few minutes he would hear something that would freeze him in his tracks. David placed a piece of fish on his father's plate, set down his chopsticks, and took a deep breath. "Dad, I need to tell you something." My father-in-law looked up at his son. "Yes, speak." David glanced at me, then turned to his mother. "This concerns Mom. I ask you, listen until the end, and then react." My mother-in-law froze, her hand clutching her spoon trembling. David pulled a stack of photos from his pocket, the ones I had taken at the gambling club. "Mom still hasn't quit gambling. She, continuing to lie, tried to borrow money from my wife again." I saw my father-in-law's eyes widen. He took the photos, examining each one. His face gradually paled. Is this true? My mother-in-law buried her face in the table. Tears flowed freely. I made a mistake, Robert. I didn't mean to. I just really wanted to. David interrupted her. This is no longer a mistake, Mom. How many times has this happened? How many times have you promised? What other excuses will you find? My father-in-law stood up, walked to a cabinet, took out a thick envelope and a stack of papers. He threw them on the table. I was going to divorce you last year, but our son cried, pleaded, and I endured. I said, if this happens again, I won't be lenient. He turned to David. And you see, a man who cannot protect his wife is not worthy of being a husband. Your wife stayed in this house only thanks to her patience. David lowered his head. Tears silently rolled down his cheeks. My father-in-law's voice was hoarse. Sarah, I apologize to you. This entire year you have carried more than anyone else. But I promise, this time I will not let this happen again. He turned to his wife, who trembled at the edge of the table. Listen to me carefully. I'm giving you two choices. First, you enter a gambling addiction treatment center. Second, I file for divorce. There is no third option. My mother-in-law burst into tears. I'm not going anywhere. Do you want to throw me out like trash? I'm not throwing you out. You brought this upon yourself. That evening, in the house where I had once hoped to find happiness, I saw how lies were destroying a family. David and I stood on the second floor. Downstairs, his father was making calls to schedule his mother's appointment with a therapist. David squeezed my hand. You see, I did it. I won't let you suffer anymore. I didn't answer immediately, looked at him for a long time, and finally nodded. Thank you for not siding with dishonesty this time. David gave a bitter laugh. I only wish I had done it sooner. I leaned against his shoulder. My heart felt lighter, but I knew there were still many challenges ahead. The truth could be exposed, but to fix everything would require not only time but also determination. That evening, when I entered my room, I saw my mother-in-law crying quietly. She looked up at me. Her voice trembled. Sarah, I know I'm guilty. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I ask one thing. If you leave here, don't hate me as an enemy. I stood silently, then slowly said, Mom, I don't hate you. I just no longer have the trust to consider you family. I don't want to hold a grudge, but I also can't pretend that nothing happened. She burst into sobs. I turned away, not wanting to watch anymore. After that family meeting, full of tears and anger, my mother-in-law seemed like a different person. There were no more complaints, pleas, or tears. She became so silent it was frightening. Sometimes, she would sit on the porch all day, staring into space. My father-in-law was unyielding. He found a reputable gambling addiction treatment center out of town and enrolled her for treatment. He declared that if she didn't go, he would file for divorce that very day. This house doesn't belong to you alone. Surprisingly, this time, my mother-in-law didn't resist. She just silently nodded. This tired nod touched me a little. Perhaps she had finally realized the abyss into which she had pushed herself and her family. David drove his mother to the center. I didn't go. I couldn't stand there and pretend to sympathize when I was the one who had suffered the most. I couldn't offer words of support because I knew that any change could only come from within, not from the pity of others. Without his mother, the atmosphere in the house became lighter, as if a heavy curtain had been lifted. David and I began to live like a real married couple again, without tension or looking over our shoulders. But, strangely, I felt an emptiness. Sometimes I unconsciously looked at the balcony, as if hoping to see a familiar silhouette. Sometimes at night, when David turned over, I would flinch because I no longer heard the familiar shuffle of slippers from the next room. I didn't miss her, but I missed the hope of a real family that I thought I had found. David tried very hard. He started everything from scratch, with small things. Returning from work, he would go to the kitchen to cook, do laundry, clean. He didn't talk about the past, didn't apologize, didn't try to move me with pretty words. He just silently did, and that's what started to disarm me. One day, as he was cooking in the kitchen, I came up behind him and hugged him, for the first time in those tumultuous months. He froze, then slowly turned and held me tight. "Have you forgiven me?" he asked in a choked voice. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I still want to be with you. And, perhaps, this is a beginning." He hugged me even tighter, saying nothing more. In the 3rd week of my mother-in-law's treatment, I received a call from the center. "Are you Carol Ann's daughter-in-law?" "Yes, this is Sarah." "Has something happened?" "The doctor would like to inform you. Carol Ann is showing signs of mild depression. She interacts little, eats poorly, and withdraws into herself. We need family support." I paused for a few seconds and replied, "I understand. I'll come today." I don't know what made me agree. Perhaps I felt that I needed to bring closure to this story, either through forgiveness or a final break. That evening, I arrived at the center. The visiting room was spacious and bright. My mother-in-law sat at a table by the window. When she saw me, she unexpectedly burst into tears. "You really came? I thought you'd never want to see me again." I sat opposite her, handing her a bag with milk and cookies. "The center said you weren't eating. How will you get better without strength?" She smiled bitterly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought if I disappeared, it would be easier for you. But now I understand. The pain I caused, no one will erase but myself." I nodded. "It's good that you understand that. I don't need your tears and pleas. I need you to do the right thing. If you truly want to atone for your guilt, start by living better, not for someone else, but for yourself." She nodded. Her trembling hand squeezed mine. "Thank you, darling. And forgive me that, because of my greed, I lost your trust." That evening, returning home, I told David everything. He listened silently, then took my hand. "You are the strongest woman I know," I smirked. "Not everyone is strong. I just got so tired that I no longer have the strength to be weak." We lay in silence. Outside, the wind picked up again. But this time, I didn't feel cold, because I understood that no one can change another if that person doesn't want to. And no one can save a family without honesty and respect. I began to realize what helped me weather this storm wasn't my patience, but the understanding that I had to live for myself. Every morning, waking up and seeing my face in the mirror without makeup, I would smile slightly, reaffirming to myself, I'm still alive. I'm still me. At work, things also improved. After my leave for personal reasons, I returned, and my colleagues warmly welcomed me. My department head, Miss Jones, called me into her office and placed a cup of warm tea on the table. "Sarah, I see leadership potential in you. Would you like to try your hand as the head of the operations department?" I was surprised. "I thought you'd choose someone with more experience." Miss Jones smiled. "Experience is one thing, but problem-solving skills, discipline, and initiative, you have all of that. I'm confident that after everything you've been through, you can manage not only work, but also yourself and others." I was touched. After all the trials, to regain trust was what made me feel that I hadn't lost. "If you believe in me, I will try my best." At home, I told David. He rejoiced like a child. "I told you, as soon as you get back on your feet, you'll shine again." I smiled, looking at him, and my heart warmed. The current David was no longer that indifferent or weak-willed husband. He had learned to admit mistakes, take responsibility, and stopped hiding behind blind obedience. That evening, as we walked in the park, he took my hand. "Sarah, if you had a choice, would you marry me again?" I playfully frowned. "Tough question. If I hadn't married you, I probably would have gotten rich sooner, without losing $20,000. David laughed, then fell silent. I squeezed his hand. "But I never regretted loving you. I only regret that we both didn't know how to properly cherish each other from the very beginning." He looked at me with gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you for not leaving me." I looked at the sky, where the moon peeked through a cloud. I stayed not out of pity. I stayed because I saw that I could still hope, and as long as there is hope, I want to give us a chance, even if it's the last one. One morning, I received a call from the rehabilitation center. "Sarah, congratulations. Carol Ann has successfully completed the treatment program. Psychological indicators are stable. The family can pick her up at any time." I hung up the phone and looked out the window. Had she really changed? I wasn't sure, but I knew that if she crossed the threshold of this house a second time, it would no longer be a right to forgiveness, but a last chance to live humanely. On the day we picked up his mother, I wore a simple white shirt. She emerged from the gates, thinner, with a short haircut, walking slowly. Seeing me, she froze. Her eyes filled with tears. "You actually came for me?" I nodded. "Because I'm a decent person." "But, Mom, decency is not weakness. From today on, live so that you become a new person. I don't want you to be a burden to anyone again, including yourself." She said nothing, just silently nodded. Tears streamed down her cheeks. At home, my father-in-law, looking at her, said only one sentence. "This time, I don't need your apologies. I need proof." My mother-in-law nodded, offering no excuses. That evening, as I lay in bed, David hugged me from behind and whispered, "I used to think a strong woman was one who knew how to sacrifice and endure. But now I understand. A strong woman is one who knows when to let go, when to hold on, and when to love herself first." I smirked. I wasn't strong from the beginning. I just had no other choice. When you're pushed to your limit, you're forced to become your own pillar of support. We lay in silence. Outside, a full moon shone, as if blessing the rebirth of a woman who had fallen, cried, but never gave up. On a July morning, the sky was clear as freshly washed glass. I sat on the porch with a cup of ginger tea, and my heart felt lighter than ever. It had been a long time since I felt such peace. Without torment, without doubts, without recurring questions in my head. What did I do wrong? Did I deserve such treatment? My mother-in-law, who had returned from the center almost a month ago, seemed to have changed too. She no longer hid her phone, didn't sneak out of the house, didn't invent excuses to chat with old friends. She became silent and reserved, not warm, but without malice. Every morning, she brewed tea, placed it on the table, and went into the garden to tend to the flowers. She no longer touched the topic of money. At dinner, she would serve vegetables, saying nothing, but sometimes her gaze was full of silent gratitude. Perhaps anyone can change when pushed to their limit. David now became the husband I had dreamed of. Not perfect, but sincere. Not overly verbose, but caring enough for me to feel valued. He still cooked in the evenings, asked about small things. "Are you tired? How was your day at work?" And most importantly, he stopped making his mother the cause of my suffering. One day, as I was hanging laundry, he hugged me from behind and whispered, "If you had left me then, I probably would have regretted it my whole life." I turned and touched his cheek. "And if I hadn't had the strength to leave, you probably never would have come to your senses." We both laughed, this time without bitterness. I enrolled in communication skills courses. One day, sharing my story with the group, I told a part of it. Everyone fell silent. One woman, about 10 years older than me, took my hand with tears in her eyes. "Girl, you are an example of a woman I admire. Not because you endured, but because you knew when to stand up." I smiled. I'm proud not of what I endured, but of not allowing myself to be buried in it. David and I decided not to have children for now. This decision didn't please many in his family, but this time I was unyielding. I wanted to be sure that I lived in a safe, decent, and fair environment before becoming a mother. I don't want a child to grow up amidst anger and hypocrisy, I told David one evening. He nodded, his gaze tender. "I understand. We'll have a child only when you're ready. No one will pressure you anymore, not even me." I smiled, and my heart warmed. One day, my mother-in-law unexpectedly entered my room with a notebook in her hands. I was a little surprised but calmly asked, "Mom, has something happened?" She placed the notebook on the table. Her voice trembled. "These are the records of all the money I borrowed from you. I know I won't be able to return it all, but I sold my jade necklace. I sold my wedding ring, and I've collected almost $3,000. I want to return it to you, so that at least financially, I no longer owe you anything." I froze, not because of the money, but because I never thought I would receive any compensation at all. I took the notebook. "I accept this not because I need the money, but because I want to acknowledge that the person you are now is not who you were before." She nodded, her eyes red. "Thank you, darling. for not turning me into someone I myself wouldn't want to be. I fell, I despaired. I wanted to abandon everything and start over. And that very desire helped me understand what I held in my hands. Today, I stand before the mirror without makeup, just a light lipstick on my lips. I smile a smile, not to hide pain, but the smile of a woman who has weathered the storm and emerged into the sun. I have been reborn. Dear listeners, Sarah's story comes to an end, and we understand one thing: no one is born strong. Only by going through bitterness is a woman forced to learn to stand up and love herself. The life of a wife can sometimes be light and peaceful, like a breeze, but sometimes it's a protracted storm, from which there seems to be no escape. However, if a woman maintains her dignity and self-respect, even if she falls, she can move forward not with resentment, but with a sense of freedom and peace. Thank you for being with Heartfelt Conversations. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new, profound, and human stories. Until next time.